As we were talking the other day, Phyllis and I were saying every time you look at the news, you see something about Israel and all the problems going on over there. And it brought back to our minds just not too many years ago, just a few years ago, we were in Israel and taking a group, as some of Ricky and others have done. And we were thinking about how peaceful it was at that time, how we went up into northern Israel. And even I had just been, before that, I'd been up in Syria and the Gaza Strip I'd been. And we were just amazed just how things have changed. So there's so much death and destruction and so much confusion going on. But this is the same peaceful place, as Fred mentioned, that our Lord was making his way to the cross about this time of the year, and nobody quite understood what he was doing. So we thought that during this holy season, these 40 days we call Lent, that Phyllis and I would help you as we walk along this time, as we call this, we pause along the way to the cross and the resurrection. At least we pause in our thinking and hopefully in some of our activities, that we'll try to think more about what Jesus must have been thinking about, what the Father was thinking about, what he was trying to say to us as the scriptures record the events of the journey to the cross. We thought we'd use this unique kind of approach, is to listen to some stories that Phyllis has written and listen to some scriptures and see if maybe the Lord, our Father, could speak to us and help us see the deeper meanings of these stories and scriptures, and not just look at skim the top of them. You know, the Lord liked to teach with stories. That was his main way of teaching. He was not so much an analytical or logical kind of making statements and doctrines. He liked to answer people's questions with stories. And so we thought we'd use a story and give you a chance to share what you see at them. I hope this morning, as we look at this story we're going to hear, that you would look at it sort of as a parable. And in the parable, there are metaphors, these characters and these objects that kind of remind us as symbols of some of the things that happened to Jesus on the cross and things that maybe happened to us. I know last week when some of you talked, it seemed like that your insights and your testimonies, they more or less helped us, the rest of us, think about how we could apply these things to our lives. So this morning, we're going to be emphasizing what we see in this story and in these scriptures about providence. I think the four things that Phyllis and I thought we would focus on in these lessons on our looking at the cross and resurrection is we look at the perseverance that our Father is trying to communicate to us, and his providence in all of this, his presence and his prideless humility. Today, we're going to be focusing on providence. And I've asked Cynthia and Cheryl to read a few scriptures about providence and to let us see what maybe God is saying to us this morning as it relates to the cross and resurrection. So Cynthia, would you read some scriptures there?
First one I have is Acts 2:23. But God knew what would happen, and his prearranged plan was carried out when God was betrayed with help of lawless Gentiles. You nailed him to a cross and killed him. Second one is Proverbs 19:21. You can make many plans, but the Lord's purpose will prevail. The last one is Isaiah 14:24. The Lord of heaven's armies has sworn this oath. It will all happen as I have planned. It will be as I have decided.
All right, thank you. So Cheryl, what are the scriptures you have there?
I have Jeremiah 1:5. God said, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart. And in Proverbs 16:9, we can make our plans, but the Lord determines our steps. And Philippians 1:6, I am certain that God, who began the good work within you, will continue his work until it is finally finished on the day when Christ Jesus returns.
All right, good. Thank you. Look like I got the sun in my face. There we go. All right, when you hear the word providence, and we talk about the providence of God, and we look at the providence of God as he was seen in Jesus walking to the cross, let me just throw out a general question, and that is, what do you think of? What does it mean to you when we talk about God's providence? Will anybody take a stab at it?
Guidance. Guidance. Guidance.
Okay, what else does it mean that God's providence is with us?
Provision,
His provision, all right. What else? Maybe just in a sentence, tell me what it says to you that we are living in God's providence.
Bill, it's Dora. I Googled it.
Oh, we got one of these high-tech people, all right.
The protective care of God.
All right. Protective care of God. What else?
Oh, it could also be the punishing hand of God.
Yes.
That's right. Thank you. Providence, God's providence. Well, some people would say, well, this thing has happened. It must be in God's providence. What does that mean?
Plan.
Okay, good. And with that said, I have taken a step that I did last week, and that is we have our resident theologian, Ricky Burke, here. And I thought, well, I'll give him the job, the hard job of telling us just when we think about the cross and the resurrection, there's a deeper meaning to these scriptures and this story we're getting ready to hear that we need to be watching for the providence of God. But Ricky, give us some insights of what comes to your mind when you think of the providence of God.
Well, I like to think, I guess a more proper definition might be God's guardianship and care of all creation, of all people and plants and everything that God has created. God has a plan for it. God takes care of it. When I think about God taking care of us, reminds me of a story. It was about a little 5-year-old boy. And believe it or not, he was one of 19 children. And one night his house caught on fire. And in the midst of all the panic and the flames and the smoke and everyone in the house, 2 parents and 19 kids yelling at one another, get out, get out. Everyone thought that the house was empty. The roof was beginning to cave in. Fire had consumed over half the house. People were outside watching it burn and crumble. And suddenly they saw through the smoke this little 5-year-old boy at a window screaming for help. And a group of men made a human ladder. There was 3 or 4 men on the bottom, and then another group of men, and then finally the one on the very top, who was able to convince this young boy to leap into his arms. And he did, and just as he did, the whole roof collapsed on top of the bedroom in which this little boy was in. And he was saved. And years later, as an adult, this little boy, who was John Wesley, the founder of Methodism, would look back and say, this was the hand of God, the providence of God. he could look back and see the hand of God involved in that, but also the hands of others, the hands of those men who formed that human ladder, who became the hands of God. And so, Bill, would you like for me to go on and make some correlation with embroidery and what?
No, let's let Phyllis tell her story, then I'm gonna call on you again. I got to think of that
Okay.
more meaningful. Okay, Rick, that's a good story because that story of Charles Wesley lifts up this question, folks, I want you to be thinking about is the question of what does it mean that we are living under God's providence? Yet theologians over the years, as I'm sure, as Ricky's kind of alluded to, they've looked at the word providence, and some of you have already said this, but there are 5 words that come to mind as all of you have kind of mentioned it. God's providence is talking about that we have a belief that God has a plan, that whenever he created the earth and man and women and all the things, that he had a plan for them. It was not just a haphazard deal. He has a purpose for these. He has a sense of what we would call a promise, and that is he's not only got a plan and a purpose, but he's promised he's going to keep it. And another P in this providence is that he has a what I would call a protection, and that is that in the plan there's going to be a lot of resistance, but there's going to be God's protection for us. And last of all, as somebody already mentioned, he has a provision. He has a way for us. So as you think about this whole idea of providence, we're going to have some pretty serious questions about the providence of God in the light of evil in the world, the providence of God and Jesus going to the cross, so that you and I can sense today, and hopefully the rest of this week, we can be thinking about God's providence in our own lives. Some of us have stories to tell about what we feel about the providence of God. So with that said, Phyllis is going to read one of her stories from her devotional book, Sacred Sense, and also her coming book. And I've asked her to do this so that we can look at this story. And now, if you would pay attention to the details of the story, because some of these have a more symbolic, a metaphorical meaning that we can, as Jesus said, some people will hear this and they don't have ears to hear. Some people have listened to it and they can see some things that are deeper. So Phyllis, why don't you take over?
Okay. This one I have entitled Embroidered Plans. Pound cake cookies are still warm and plated, and the kitchen is smelling like sweetness. I bake all kinds of decadent cookies, but this plain one is my favorite. But then again, I'm the one who orders 2 scoops of vanilla in the ice cream shop. These golden discs of butter and sugar are like eating that crunchy top of Mama's pound cake. Now, this cookie recipe has a story, but it's the story of the linen tablecloth underneath that plate of cookies that I want to tell you. A few years ago, while vacationing with friends in the Napa Valley in Sonoma, California, my friend and I were in a resale shop. She was rummaging for vintage clothing that could be used as costumes for a performing group she directed. And I just wandered the aisles, looking and wondering how all these items wound up in this shop. Everything from Waterford goblets to garden hoses, and fancy pillows to pot holders. But then I saw it, or at least the corner of it. An ecru linen tablecloth with a stamped border. I took the piece from the stack and unfolded it to discover that only one corner of it had been embroidered. The stamped design of vines and blossoms around the hem was still visible, but barely. As I held it, I had the sense that tablecloth had been waiting for me. I knew from the sign out front that all the items in the store were donated and all proceeds from sales supported a women's shelter in the area. Wanting to know something of its past, I took the cloth to the front and inquired. The volunteer shopkeeper smiled at me, took the cloth from my hands, and said, "Oh, we get so many items delivered that I can't remember them all, but I do remember this one." She then told me the story of an elegant elderly lady in the community who had passed away a couple of years ago. The elegant elderly lady had been a supporter of the resale shop for years, and it was natural that the lady's daughter had donated most of her mother's personal possessions when she died. "Oh, she had so many beautiful things," the shopkeeper said as she ran her fingers over the embroidered corner, "and most of them sold very quickly. But not this piece. We've marked it down a few times. Seems no one wants a partially embroidered tablecloth, even if it is the finest linen." I couldn't hold it any longer. "I want it. I'd like it, please. How much?" I had plans for that tablecloth. "That'll be $5. Only $5? I felt my eyes widen and my eyebrows go north. In all my years, my face has still not learned to conceal surprise, especially if it's delighted surprise. "But how much was it originally?" I asked. "If I recall, it was $20. I immediately pulled out a $20 bill and handed it to her. "I'll pay the full price. I love the story, and after all, it's for a good cause." Proud of my purchase, I went outside, found a bench to rest my feet, and I imagined all the characters involved in this story. The elegant elderly lady sitting near a window sorting thread, the daughter in tears going through her mother's sewing basket, the unnamed women who would be helped by the proceeds raised from the resale shop. And it was on that bench I hatched my plan. I knew someone who did meticulous needlework. And within a week, my purchase was in the mail to Mama with a plea. Mama honored that elegant elderly lady's work and did her very best to match the thread, the peaches and yellows and pinks and various greens, and completed the tablecloth over the next several weeks. And years later, I'm still enjoying that piece of story-laden linen, remembering a Saturday morning in Sonoma and remembering the day I opened the box with the finished tablecloth Mama sent. There's a bit of sacred sense in this story. The designer of that tablecloth did his job in creating the design, giving someone else the task of bringing it to life with colorful threads. The elegant elderly lady in California started embroidering and probably hoped to see the cloth on her table. But it took another talented woman from across the country in Georgia to finish the piece. The beautiful work was completed, although it went through many hands. The linen makers, the designers, the elegant elderly ladies, her daughters, the shopkeepers, mine, and finally, my mother's hands. Somehow, I see God's work like that. In his providence, he has plans, grand designs for people's lives, and many things he wants to see fulfilled. Sometimes the task is fulfilled by one, but more often by many. Our job is to perform whatever part of the task he has given us in his plan and be grateful that he gives us an opportunity to work in his world. With him as the designer, lives and work can be fulfilled, completed, and made beautiful. I recall a seminary professor standing behind his podium on our very first day of class. He announced as he pointed his finger at each of us, there is something that each of you can do better than anyone else in the world. That thought piqued interest in a classroom full of ministers. The professor continued, and that is to be you, the best you God made you to be. Ponder that today. With God's providence in mind, and given where you are and the people around you, think of something you might do today that no one else can do. The one thing that would really make a difference to someone. Then be like Jesus and do it. The end.
Well, that's a great story, isn't it? Thank you, Phyllis. As I think about this story, I'm thinking about the many stories, parables that Jesus told us to teach us the great truths that are beneath the story. He told the story of the Good Samaritan. He wasn't just talking about a guy riding down the road on a donkey and seeing a fella in the ditch. We know he was talking about much, much greater truth about both of these people and everything else in that story. And when he told the story about the vine and the branches and some of them die and all that stuff, he wasn't just talking about vine and branches. He was talking about people and God. And, so this story that Phyllis has just told us of this wonderful tablecloth story, I am so impressed with the symbolism of the providence of God. Ricky, I'm calling on you again to get us started, get everybody thinking. When you hear this story, what does it remind you of the providence of God?
Well, I'll go back to the story of John Wesley being rescued. He could see the big picture was the hand of God. Yet, as part of that big picture, there were people who became the hands of God. And so, as I think about Phyllis's story, I made a list here of all that was involved in creating that piece of embroidered linen. I'm sure I've left something out, but there was the cotton grower, the manufacturer of the cloth, the designer of the cloth, the woman who had embroidered one quarter, her daughter, the resale shop and its volunteers, Phyllis's mom, and then Phyllis. And I'm sure I'm leaving someone out. God created all of that. God created the earth, that grew the cotton plant, everyone else who did their part. But in order for that to come together, for providence to be fulfilled, everyone had to do their part. And here we are in the midst of Lent. As Fred said in his prayer, we're moving to the cross and the resurrection. In the resurrection, we find the fulfillment of God's plan of salvation. We see that in Jesus Christ. And yet before Christ, there were many other people bringing that story along. We think of Abel and Noah and Samuel and David and all the prophets and John the Baptist and others that were the hands of God that in that plan of salvation that found its fulfillment once again in Jesus. And in Lent, we are reminded that we too are part of God's salvation. It's not just ours to receive and hoard, if you will. Once we receive it, we are part of that plan. And so the question, and I'll include this, I wrote down this part that Phyllis, a line from her story. She was talking about what the seminary professor told all the students that day. There's something each of you can do better than anyone else in the world. And of course, all we do is supposed to be for God. So what is our unique part in God's plan of salvation? Bill?
All right. Thank you, Ricky. I think that's a good description of some of the elements of this story that remind me of all that God had planned. You know, one of the scriptures that the ladies read this morning, it said, I believe it's Isaiah, Isaiah 1:5, which has always been a mystery, and especially in this day and time. Oh my goodness. Jeremiah said, God said, I knew you before I formed you in your mother's womb. Before you were born, I set you apart. Each one of you. I knew you before you were born. I've set you apart for something for you to do, something special, and he's going to carry it through. Now, when you think of that scripture, folks, and you think of this story that Phyllis has read, which is a story that reminds us of God's providence, what does that say to you about Jesus? Let's just think a moment about Jesus heading to the cross before he was born, while he was living. What part did God have in all this? I mean, that's a big mysterious question, but you probably have some things that come to your mind. Who would share with me what that says? All right, come on now. Who'll go first? I know your mind must be buzzing. When you hear that story that Phyllis has told, what was it about the cross and the resurrection and Jesus' journey that came to your mind in that story?
Bill, this is Becky.
Yes, Becky, thank you.
So what comes to my mind, both in the story of Jesus and his journey to the cross, but also in Phyllis's story, is how they're both telling us about what love looks like. And Jesus's journey to the cross, he's teaching us all the various forms in the context of what our daily life would be like about love. And then, at the apex, when he's at the cross and then beyond the cross with the resurrection, how love has such a long tail, eternity, endless, constant, in the way he is still promising us that he's here with us and loves us, and the grace and confidence he gives us. But it's like that I got with Phyllis's story, the same thing. It started with the love of that elderly woman who, I bet she had love in her heart when she was working on that tablecloth. And then what love looked like after she left, and the other hands that tablecloth was in. The daughter donated the tablecloth. She didn't have to donate it. She could have sold it somewhere, but with her heart full of love, she donated it. And with Phyllis's heart full of love, she gave more than it was valued at the time. And those coins that ended up being enriching and benefiting, the workers in the store, and the ability to get, other goods to do the same. So it keeps on. So just like Jesus keeps on, it just made me think about what happened in Phyllis's story, just kept on. But that love looked different.
Yes.
We forget what love looks like sometimes.
Well, thank you, Becky. That's very insightful. Tell me this. I've heard some of your story along the way, and I've always been impressed with it. How do you relate this to your own life? Seeing God's hand in his love for Jesus, for other people, and in that story. But
Well, I'll tell you what, just this morning,
you see the providence of God in your own life in this way. Does he know what's going on in Becky's life? Does he have a plan for your life?
well, yes, he does. And a lot of times I don't know what it is, but I really like how he shows me love in so many ways, just like this morning. For example, I know Dale has, like many of us, of you, just has a pound of things that he needs to get done. And And I asked him, well, do you want to do Sunday school today? And he said, yes. And I knew that he could have been doing a lot of other things that he's stressed about getting done. But he said, and I thought, you know what? That's love right there. And so that's God showing me what love is and being a hand in my life.
That's good. Well, Dale, it's a time to defend yourself. I've always been impressed with a guy who's flying all over the world and staying busy solving all the problems so the rest of us can just sit around and take it easy. I've always noticed that you're a man of faith, and I wonder, when you started out as a young boy on a farm, do you think God had a plan for your life?
You know, I think he did, Bill, and probably the way it was evidenced the most to me was through my grandmother and my mother. You know, their love, their caring, and their nurturing guided me towards a path, but I think God had a plan and transmitted that love from them through me that really helped my career develop. So there's a path and a providence in all of our lives, and I think that was just my providence and my plan.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Dale. That's always been an inspiration to me. You know, I've thought about, some folks I know would disagree with me, but I think instead of you being out on the tractor this morning doing some of the things you want to do, it's God's providence that you're here to testify, to give a story, so that the rest of us are highly encouraged, and we like to know that God has his hand in your life and Becky in your life. It's that's just the way that some of us Christians feel, that there is something about God knowing what's going on and he's involved in it, isn't it? Well, let's see, who else can tell me maybe that this story reminds you of something? Maybe it's a little different, but does the story remind you anything of Jesus and God's hand in his life and providentially working? I mean, he had a lot of, if God had a plan for Jesus, it sure did not include just a rosy path. He had a pretty rough route, didn't he? Who else wants to say a word about what the story meant to them?
Hey, this is Mark, Bill. I think that, you know, Jesus had a path, but I think he kind of knew where he was going. And then there was a kind of a map for him. And the way I relate it to myself, it's being the scientist that I am, I've gone through different paths in my life all the time. But for some reason, my path keeps back intersecting with this path. So I know that there's a path there, you know, and I think it comes down to who do you want to follow? And I think we all take a detour, fall off the path every once in a while. And I look back, like I just said, I look back on my parents and grandparents, and I think they set the stage early, but then I'll go off on a path over here, but then all of a sudden now I'm 70 years old and I run across the heart-to-heart people or something else. And all of a sudden my path gets straightened out again. So I've got to where I almost don't worry about it. I've got to where I look for more cues now, you know, to kind of keep me in line, and I keep finding them everywhere. So it's kind of interesting.
Thank you. That was good. I appreciate that. You know, I'm thinking about that tablecloth too, the fact that Phyllis brought out that idea of the designer who made the print. I know Phyllis still does these things. She still does this needlework, and she'll get these plans that people have figured out and artists have drawn, and they've printed them. So she gets this piece of linen and it's got these beautiful designs on them. And I think, oh my goodness, how in the world is this going to turn out? But somehow it comes out beautiful. I wonder about you all. What do you think about God's plan? Does God plan like a blueprint for a house? He's got something he wants to get done in your life, and that's it, buddy. If you don't stick on that plan just right, you're going to be in a mess. Or does God basically just have a general purpose for your life, and I mean, this is a mysterious thing, isn't it? What is that story, Phyllis, that story that you told? Um, do you think that maybe God expects you to do exactly what he said? Or how do you see that?
Boy, you asked me the easy one, didn't you? Um, all of the above. I think God has a plan. I think when God spoke the world into existence and created a perfect place, I think that's what he desired. But as Becky so beautifully put it, in his love for us, he gave us a will, and in his compassionate love, he made a way when we get off the path, when we don't follow the blueprint. We're not cast aside. We're not thrown into the rubbish. He makes a way, just like the designer of this tablecloth. The lady didn't, her intention was to finish it, but she didn't get to. But the plan was not thwarted. The design was fulfilled. And I think God, in his infinite mercy, when he saw us mess up, he said, Plan B. And Jesus came to provide the direction and to fulfill his plan and to leave us, as Bill, you've said, with stories and answers that help us stay on God's plan for our lives. But I've kind of moved from thinking so much of God's plan for me as a blueprint to thinking of God's plan for me is to live his way. That's his plan. And everything that means, so there you have it.
Thank you, Phyllis. I think that's very helpful and insightful. Some of you others, I think of Ricky. I think like when you started out, you didn't start out as a little boy saying, I'm gonna be a preacher or pastor. Do you think you were against God's plan and his will? I know my brother-in-law, Ron Geiger, he started off as an FBI agent. He was a 40-year-old man doing FBI work. And one day he felt like that was not God's purpose for his life. So did he make a mistake? Or was his being an FBI agent part of God's plan? Did God's plan just kind of take a right turn, or how do you see that, Ricky?
Well, I can look back on my life and see that around the age of 20, God called me to preach. I was asked to preach on a Sunday evening in a little Methodist church up on the Panhandle. And I did preach, and after the service, there probably wasn't 25, 30 people, but they all came up to me and said, Ricky, you are called to preach. And it just scared the fool out of me. And so because with the exception of one preacher, all the others I knew were sadly nobody I wanted to be like when I grew up. And I knew their kids, and they were the hellions in high school, And so I thought, God, I don't want to do that to my family to come. So I think I was outside God's plan for that season in my life. It would be 10 years before I would finally capitulate and say, I'm gonna do it, Lord, no matter what it costs me. But even during that 10 years, I learned a lot. I grew a lot. I was in sales. I learned, how to relate to people, understand people, different personalities and characteristics, and a lot of other things that would help me when I eventually went into the ministry. So I would say it was not best, but it was not lost.
Yes. That's very good. In fact, I think that's very good. It's understanding God's purpose, his ultimate purpose, his long-range plan, and trying to understand his temporary plan or his temporary purpose is something each of us have to deal with. It's like this tablecloth. It may have been designed, the purpose of it is to do a beautiful cloth and give it to somebody that they enjoy, but along the way, there were some things that really good came out of it before it ever got to the finished product, didn't it? I'm thinking about, Phyllis and I were reading in our devotional time a story this morning about a fellow who was one of the richest manufacturers in our country. And he became a Christian. He asked his pastor, should I quit my job as a CEO and the founding of this major company that has 2,500 employees? He said, should I quit that and become a preacher? And the pastor said, no, don't at all do that. He said, you have a flock bigger than most people ever have. You have 2,500 people. They won't pay attention to you when you become a preacher, but you're the CEO of that company. Be a witness to them. So he found his new purpose, and he was shocked that the pastor told him to stay in there. You know, I started out, Ricky, as an artist, a young boy who had a gift that God gave me. I said, well, if God gave me this gift at 10 years old, I was painting portraits. I thought, well, I'll go to college. So I went off to college to be an artist. But I got, like you, I got this call. So, but that art has given me some things I never would have gotten if I just started out. Have any of you had that same experience to feel like God has a purpose for me, but along the way I needed to go through the desert? Along the way I got wounded, I got hurt. But those hurts and those wounds have now made me a better person. Any of you had that kind of experience? Any of you feel like the plan of God is maybe not, and that I stay in the same thing all the time? Who go first?
It's Mark again. I'll go first.
Thank you.
I think of my kids and my grandkids. I've spent, looking back on it in retrospect, a lot of time, as most parents do, trying to mold our children into what we think they should be. And you know how that works out. And then mysteriously, God gives us grandkids. And mysteriously, we inherited one of our grandbabies at a very early age due to some illness and other issues in the family. And miraculously, what has happened through that whole process with our 3 grandkids, I don't think I've really ever tried to mold them at all. I've listened to them and looked at them, and they do things I don't like and all of that. But I think our whole approach through that process has been to look, listen, and love, and maybe provide guidance if needed, but have never tried to mold them into something that I think might be best for them. And all of a sudden they've all turned out on a path, you know, that is kind of fun to watch.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Who else have seen the God's hand in this, in their lives?
Ricky, it's Dora. I wasn't going to talk this morning, but I think I've got a little story too. Phyllis, I have to tell you, I also have an embroidery story. My embroidery story, though, is quite different than yours in a sense. When I was about, I guess I was probably about 9 or 10. We were at the ranch one summer with my 2 aunts, my 2 maiden aunts who were school teachers, and the 3 of us girls. Now, I have 2 sisters and we're all within 3.5 years. So here are these 2 aunts that, thank goodness, they had been running school for years, so they were used to kids, keeping us while Mother and Daddy had some time off. And they decided that year that we were going to learn to embroider. Well, my piece of material that I had, which was actually not a pretty piece of linen, but it was a flour sack. And we we're supposed to work with this stamped picture on our flower set. Well, my stamp didn't come out quite right. And I'm not an artist. I am all right with being an illustrator in the sense that I can take a picture and I can draw it, but I am not an artist in the fact that I can actually see something. And I never finished that piece of work. Plus the fact I was wanting to be outside more than I wanted to handle a needle. But over time, that piece of fabric keeps showing up. It's in my drawer right now. It's one of the cloths we use to dry with. Also, I used what I learned from that cloth to make many different things in my lifetime for someone else. And I look at that now, and I look at my two aunts who are just trying really to find something for us to do and keep us quiet as something that I can carry with me now. Their patience, their love, their understanding, their ability to let us be and let us grow.
Yes.
And I think God does and Christ do have plans for us, but it's not always such a stamped plan.
All right. Thank you. Thank you. That was wonderful. It makes me think a great deal. In fact, it was right in the middle of it, is bringing up some questions I have about some of the things that some of the people right here in this class this morning are going through. You know, one of the scriptures that was read was this one from Acts where the writer says, God knew what would happen. His prearranged plan was carried out when Jesus was betrayed. With his help of lawless Gentiles, you nailed him to the cross and killed him. Part of God's plan, his long-range plan, his mission for Jesus' purpose in coming was, I guess, multiple purposes, but his ultimate purpose was to die and to be raised again. But, you know, it seemed like Jesus went through a lot, and the question comes to our mind, was it part of God's plan? Is what you're going through maybe something that either you needed or God had a hand in it, or is it something just hanging up and you have to deal with it? Charlie, I'll pick on you this morning because you don't mind. You give me permission to call on you anytime. So I'm going to call on Charlie this morning.
Yeah.
You know, when you go through some tough stuff like you've been going through, do you look at it and say, oh my goodness, this is not God's plan. This is not what God wants. He didn't know this was going to happen, so I guess I better just deal with it. Or you say, well, maybe I'm going to use this. Or how do you look at this, Charlie, when you're in the middle of it? What do you say to God when you're just alone? Give us some insight.
Well, I try very hard not to say the word why. You know, it is what it is.
Yeah.
I am blessed that my Lord and Savior is shoulder to shoulder with me going through this. And that with his help and his guidance, whatever's going to happen is going to be the best thing for me. The worst thing I can do is start asking why and start saying, you know, maybe I need to do this. Maybe God needs a little help here. So for me, it's just keep looking to the forefront. You know, I've got a picture I send out. That's why the windshield on the car is so much bigger than that rear view mirror in the car. It's looking with God's help where I'm going, not where I've been.
Thank you, Charlie. That's really helpful. I guess some of you probably have some other insights into that. Thinking about You know, Jesus on his way, we're thinking this morning in our minds, Jesus on his way to the cross. He knows it's not going to be an easy road. He knows those soldiers are going to really beat him up bad. He knows that cross is going to be painful. I think about that a lot, that he went through that for us. And I'm thinking, not that God wanted him to suffer or God planned on him suffering, but I'm like Charlie, I'm not going to ask why that happened, but I just know that Jesus said to himself, well, this is going to happen, and I've got to make a decision what to do about it. Am I going to say, Lord, I'm not doing this, or Lord, I don't want to do this, but I will do it. When you're looking at these things, folks, we all of us or all of those we love, just about everybody around us at this time in our lives are having to say that to ourselves. Am I going to let this be useful to me, or am I going to say it's just an interruption? Some of you others, what do you say about these hard times that have come in your life? Has it actually worked out to be what you think is part of God's plan for your life? Anybody got a comment?
Oh, this is Cheryl. Sorry, trying to find the words. I think walking alongside my brother and my mother as my brother passed away, and my mom now, and then I lost a stepson in a car accident. And I think one of my paths, I just retired, I was in healthcare, and leaving that behind and knowing that you can't fix situations. Sometimes you can walk alongside, but I think knowing that we all face that same path as Jesus did, maybe not as violent, but walking along towards the cross, our own deaths, and learning from people that have done that. Ultimately, that's where we all go. And I think about what that means, and sometimes I feel like I've been that voice on GPS where reconfigure. But I think it's just really hitting me that journey, the piece of it, the lovely, the guidance, and the humility of it is very, very precious but painful.
Yes. Yes, very helpful. Let me ask one last question here to close. I think I'm going to let Roger lead the way. Roger, you always have some good comments. Tell me what you think. Jesus is on his way to the cross. He's going through some rough times. Can you imagine, when you think about all the scriptures that talk about Jesus talking to his Father, Jesus facing all this stuff? Can you imagine what Jesus' attitude was towards the hard things that were happening to him? In your mind, did he see these things as God's will, or how did that fit into the providence of God to his own Father and him? What are some random thoughts you have? I'd be interested.
Well, knowing what Jesus thought, given that he was spirit and man, I have a hard time even deigning to speak what he thought. But for me, when we go through things that are difficult, and how do you rationalize it so you can stay true to what you believe about God's plan for you? I think that there's tremendous amount of uncertainty that we just have to accept in our faith, in our lives. I don't know if you know what a tagline is on an email, but a few years ago, when I was caring for Carol with her ALS, I had a tagline that I put on my emails that said you can't know the strength of your anchor until you feel the fury of the storm.
Amen.
Yes.
It was meaning for me at that time, dealing with the uncertainty and like Charlie, you know, you asking why is a dangerous road to take.
Amen.
But anyway, that was a part of my life that taught me a lot. But now, when I think about God's plan for my life, and yes, I do believe he has it has a plan. So I used to think it was going to be a more dramatic role than what I play. I look at you and Phyllis and the ministry that you all had. I look at Mark going down to Guatemala. I look at my friend Fred, who started Golfers for Others, and they're pretty darn significant responses to God's will for them. But now I have a lesser awareness or more awareness of that the role may not be so great. But when we were talking about the plan, I may be the only person that meets a person in need today. And if I am compassionate and kind and loving to that person, then maybe that was the plan for God for me today. So now, back to did Jesus know? What did he feel? My tagline now that I put on my emails is to live well requires the ability to live with great uncertainties. And that's the road I see in front, that's going to carry me through for a while. I'll make you have a different tagline in 5 years. I don't like to, but that's the fact is we have to have faith despite an incredible amount of uncertainties.
Well, thank you. That was exactly what I thought would come out, and I'm gonna let Phyllis have the next to the final word. One word, Phyllis, before I let you close. I know there's a lot of you could tell more stories, but let me just say this. I say the beginning to this to the end that I think Becky stole the thunder this morning from what I was wanting to conclude is regardless of how you understand God's plan, God's individual details, the rough times, how you understand that the final purpose in your life, or whether you're just as some would say, you're just a babysitter in the church or you're the preacher, you have an important part. You know why? One word, what Becky brought out, God's love. And that's what providence is all about. And that's what we're thinking about. Jesus went through everything. We don't understand, like we said, we don't understand all the details, but we do understand this, that God loved us so much, he sent his son, Jesus, who in essence was God's own way coming here. And he went through everything because he loved us. And you know what? I know whatever I'm going through, whatever you're going through, the thing that drives us forward is no matter what it is, a beautiful morning like today or a really tough day, I know that God's with me. He loves me. He's going to carry me through, and all this other stuff, it just has to take back seat. That's what's driving us forward to carry out his purpose and whatever he's put before us. Phyllis, what you got to say?
Well, I read you a story this morning. It was true. It really happened. But now I'm going to tell you the truth with a capital T. God did not spare Jesus pain, but Jesus persevered because he knew his purpose. And are we not glad for our experience with God's love? And then I was reminded this morning, hearing some of your stories and Ricky's comments and Bill's comments, what Paul tells us, that all things work together for good for those who love our Lord. He can take our pain. He can take our purpose. He can take everything there is about us and make something good of it. I don't think even Jesus, Roger, in his humanity on the cross, when he's crying, Lord, why have you forsaken me? He felt it. He felt the pain. But then he realized his purpose in committing, Lord, I commit myself to you. And just that word, God's going to take whatever it is for those of us who love him, and he's going to make something good out of it.
Thank you, Phyllis. Well, we wish you all a good week and look forward to seeing you next week as we hear another interesting, fascinating story from our old storyteller, Phyllis Jean. All right. Thank you, Ralph.
Well, thank you, everybody. Tremendous lesson again, and Phyllis, thank you for the story. I was reminded this morning as Fred was opening us in prayer, and you alluded to it, Phil, as we finished in John 3:16. And one of my early lessons this morning, prior to coming up here, was from my friends Bill and Phyllis. And 3:16 is very familiar to us. But this morning's lesson was about 2 Thessalonians 3:16. All right, and where Paul, the apostle Paul writes, may the Lord of peace himself give you peace at all times and in every way. And so that would just been on my mind ever since I read it early this morning on the way here. And then Fred opens in that prayer about a peace for our country, about a prayer for our country as we go through this time. Pastor Lori walks in and walked out with Dale. I'm thinking about the turmoil in our own church that is coming, that is here. The turmoil in our lives that my brother Charlie's going through, Dora, Joe, I mean, lots of folks, Mark traveling, and we're praying it all goes well. But there is only one source of our peace. And that's the Lord of peace himself.
Amen.
So we pray that upon all of you today and for the week coming. Mark, safe travels. We look forward to hearing great stories on our way back.
Yeah.
We'll see y'all next week. Thank you much. God bless.